Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. Something in store, I call this principle of low energy storage buildings. At Statens Museum for Kunst in Copenhagen, we have approximately a little over 7,000 paintings, 240,000 prints and drawings, 3,000 sculptures, including plaster casts, and we can't display it all. About 1,500 of the objects are on permanent display, and we have about 1,000 objects on loan to various institutions around the country, mainly the royal palaces, and the rest will be in storage. Currently, we have borrowed space at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, who built a low-energy storage facility a few years back, but that renting period is running out rapidly. So we are trying to team up with other museums to instigate a new plan. This plan will include working with our Natural History Museum across the street. And they have millions of objects, but of an entirely different character, of course. So we're going to find out if we can work with them. And the pointer doesn't work to shift, so I do it by finger. And we want to investigate if a low energy storage building would be feasible for our collections. For the low energy storage buildings, I mean in temperate climate zones. That would be a building quite contrary to what we have heard about in Rotterdam. It's a highly insulated building envelope, so-called superstructure, which should reduce all kinds of temperature variations. It has a high thermal inertia, using the ground in the heat in the ground for keeping a stable climate inside. There's no active heating whatsoever, and there's a very low air exchange rate and no forced ventilation. And a mechanical dehumidification can be set in if necessary, which could eventually also be driven by solar power. And the reason that we go for these kind of very low-tech and low-cost environment is also that as a government institution, we've been forced by the current government to cut down 14% of our energy consumption over the next 10 years. And that we have to reduce somewhere. And we cannot just invite people in with big sweaters, but we have to do something. Here's one of these museum storage facilities outside in the countryside. It's in Ribe. It's from 2006, one of the first ones that were based on this principle, and where you have racks in a huge storage facility with a relative humidity of 50%, fairly stable all over the year, but you have variations in temperature that varies within the limits that we see from the maybe also the American Institute of Climate and the Smithsonian Institute working together to defining these limits, and that would be between 45% and 60%, and you would have annual fluctuations within these parameters. We would also have inside the Ribe a dry store for archival material. That could also be prints and drawings, where you would have a low of 30% relative humidity over the year. There you see the inside and the outside fluctuations of temperature. The temperature inside the storage facility coming down to a low of approximately 8 to 9 degrees in winter, and in summer period it's never above the 15 degrees centigrade. That would be reducing costs enormously, of course, that you don't need to heat your storage facility. It would also mean that, that you would have to handle the objects in a different way than what many of you have already explained. We cannot have people going in and out all the time, and especially in winter time, we need to find facilities to make curators or others that handle objects, handle it in a safe way. We all know that when we are freezing or cold, our manual dexterity is not as good as it is at room temperature. So the whole handling issue is something that we have to review. Here's another graph where you see again the temperatures, but you also see the relative humidity that's fluctuating as Danish climate does dramatically, but inside you keep it relatively stable within this. Which also means that this storage facility will work with an annual energy consumption of just less than 2 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. And that is about, if I compare it with our museum, which we can find on a state website where it is measuring all the time how much we lower our energy consumption, so we can really be good guys. There we can see that our energy consumption in the museum is about 3,000 kilowatt hours per cubic meter, which is entirely different story. And we have to cut down 14%. Another storage facility in Vejle on the east coast of Jutland was built in 2004, and a new extension in 12. No windows, very few doors, very fancy interior, a lot of storage facility, and again, a 50% is easy to maintain in these kind of low-tech. The floor is completely flat, no vibrations when you go with carts over it, not from one room to the other either, because if we are having cold or cold objects, there should be no shocks taking place during these transports. There are several levels of it, again within the 50%. A shared storage facility for a number of museums in northern part of Jutland operates in the same way. You see the anonymous, boring building out there in the countryside, and full of all these paintings hanging on racks. Now, we have some challenges here, and the challenges were expressed by Marian F. Mecklenburg from the Smithsonian Institute, who stated that we should be careful that when you lower the temperature below the 12 degrees centigrade, you may come close to what's called the glass transition temperature of acrylic emulsion paints, contemporary artworks. The glass transition temperature means that when you get below a certain temperature, the object becomes very fragile, it becomes very stiff because of the cooling, and when you then touch it, it may crack, or there may come crackles in the surface of that object. And if you're transporting it over floors that are not completely smooth, you may run into risks of damaging an object. So, but is this now always true in all cases? And another one was that conservators warn that cooling may result in failure of the adhesion of lined paintings, especially if they were done with modern materials such as, for instance, Plextol, which was used very much in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, or the so-called Biba films for lamination of an old canvas onto a new canvas to stabilize it. So also there might be a challenge. Some conservators actually remove modern linings from paintings by cooling down the areas, because then it's easier to tear off again. Now, some of you definitely know that there's a new Netherlands collection center being built close to Amersfoort, which has an enormous surface area, as you see, 30,000 square meters, which will house objects from museums, 675,000. That will have a low limit of 14 degrees centigrade. I'm informed by the ICN in Amsterdam, but Ankersmit that I have been in contact with. And it's also designed so they can make short raising of temperature in the rooms where curators or others come to evaluate objects, to define exhibitions and whatever. But it is not a low energy storage facility like the ones that we are contemplating in Copenhagen. Again, how do we use the collections that are in storage? That's one of the questions that several of you have raised as well. And of course, we have a lot of lending, paintings going in and out. And of course, when we operate with low energy storage facilities, we also have to acknowledge that is it then valid to still claim very rigid temperature margins for works in transit, this 24-hour limit for acclimatization? Is it always relevant? Or are we now trying to open up for a whole new review of the ways that we handle objects, both in storage but also outside storage, if we acknowledge that we can operate in a different temperature arena than the one we've been used to? Now, you have shown examples, some of you. Here is from the Museum of Wisconsin. They have lots of paintings on display, and these displays shift again and again. It's not a low temperature facility. It is a facility where people go in and enjoy the storage facilities, enjoy the exhibition. I wanted though to, before I close this, to make a comment here that got in breaking news, because I posed these questions about the glass transition temperature to a colleague of mine who is head of the science at the Getty Conservation Institute, Tom Lerner. And he writes me back here yesterday morning, of course you have an important question there to discuss. It's true that below a material's glass temperature, it becomes very brittle and prone to cracking if it's knocked, etc. So on the face of it, taking your storage down to these levels would go through the temperature grades of most acrylic paints, but also other objects. It's really hard, he says, to measure a glass temperature transition temperature precisely. All the different thermal analytical techniques all seem to give different numbers, but I think most people would state that somewhere around 10 to 18 degrees would be okay. However, I'm not sure if this means that you cannot safely store your acrylic paintings at temperatures down to 9 degrees at winter. After all, certain acrylic paints have glass transition temperatures at room temperature or above to 25 degrees centigrade, which means that they are always below, very, very often, glass transition temperature. And you even have some other stuff like acrylic varnishes that we have on many of the paintings, old masters or moderns, which have a glass transition temperature about 40 degrees centigrade. And they do not crack every time we touch the objects. So the danger, he says, is probably more the rapid fluctuations in temperature. If you take out an object for loan from a 9-degree storage facility, you take it into a warmer environment and you have to transport it from that storage facility that probably will be outside the city center to the museum for further checking, crating, and shipping. And that's where we come into the debate about how close are these limits that we are used to work with, temperature-wise and relative humidity-wise. So we have to review all this, and but he ends up saying to me, Tom Lerner, how great that you are building a low-energy storage facility. Bravo. Because we have to think of the carbon footprint that we are leaving behind at the same time as we are taking care of our collections. We also know that keeping objects between 9 and 15 degrees keeps them much, much longer in a much better condition. So we have to make a choice. That was as far as I wanted to go now. Thank you.